Wales has always been a mystery to me, as I knew of it, but I knew nothing about its history, or why its culture and language is so different from the rest of Great Britain. So, I made this video to quell my own interests. Wales was inhabited by modern humans who were hunter-gatherer peoples for many centuries, and these people eventually developed tribe systems among themselves. Trade was majorly important to the development of Welsh culture and technology, as they were on the coast near Ireland and mainland Europe, while having access to land routes with England and Scotland. Through this trade, the Welsh were introduced to their Bronze Age, which made them part of the bell-beaker culture that was nearly universal across Western Europe. Tin and copper are the important components to bronze, and luckily for the Welsh, there were several tin and copper deposits in Wales that facilitated trade with the rest of Europe, and Wales became extremely successful because of this, especially as the local people became extremely skilled in ornating bronze with intricate patterns. This same trade was what brought the Celtic people and culture of the mainland to Wales, and brought the region into its Iron Age. A major indicator of the full onset of the Welsh Iron Age was the abundance of Celtic styles in art and weaponry, and the abundance of hill forts. It is not entirely known the purpose of these hill forts though, as many are situated in not defensively advantageous positions, which, for these particular hill forts, leads some to believe that these sites were more of a location of stock exchange, or a show of wealth by the local leaders. There were 5 Welsh Iron Age tribes we know of around the time that the Romans arrived on the British Isles, which were the Silures, Demetae, Ordovices, Gangani, and the Desiangli. These tribes, however, were described by the Romans, so the term tribe probably meant a people who were of a similar culture, but held little to no allegiance to one central authority. Wales is very rich in minerals, which made the lands very enticing for the Romans. However, Wales is also a very mountainous land, and the people were hyper-militarized, which delayed the invasion of the lands until after the English Midlands were conquered. The beginning of the Roman invasion of Wales is understood to be the Roman attack upon the Desiangli people, in one of the few flat parts of Wales that touches England. The Desiangli fell quite easily, but the native English leader Caractacus, who had previously led English tribes in their resistance of Rome, had come to Wales, and united the forces of the Ordovices and Silures to fight back further Roman incursions in Wales. And while the resistance was fierce, this fight was all for naught, as the Welsh people would eventually fall to the Romans piece by piece. Under the Romans, mining capabilities were increased due to Roman technologies and practices being introduced to the land. However, the lack of large swaths of farmable land made it so that there wasn't much Roman settlement of the land, and the people of Wales were able to escape the Romanization that England experienced. There was a constant Roman military presence in the region to prevent and subdue revolts. But this all changed as the Romans began to pull out of the land because of constant foreign raids. While in the east, Britain was being invaded by mainland European tribes, in the west, there was more of a peaceful diffusion of Irish Celts into Wales. This migration severely impacting the Welsh language and culture. A new era now begins in Wales, with the land being divided among many small kingdoms. Our knowledge on these states is very limited, as their early documentation is scarce. But we do know of a few powerful kingdoms. One of the most powerful kingdoms at the time was in fact one established by the Irish, Dyfed. But Gwynedd and Powys were also formidable kingdoms that were locally Welsh. When the Romans left, there was still somewhat of a Celtic identity in Britain, but this changed, as from the small pockets on the eastern shores of Britain, Germanic people began their expansion throughout the island. Welsh leaders of Powys and Gwynedd would often send soldiers, or even armies, to resist these Germanic invasions. But the Germanic people were too powerful, and pushed the Celtic kingdoms to the fringes of the island, and an important stronghold for the Celtic culture was Wales. This period for Wales is quite complex, as the way kingdoms passed on their titles to new heirs often led to civil wars between competitors, or simply the kingdom would be split amongst several heirs. Because of this, there was no real unified identity of Wales. The most unifying feature of the Welsh was that they were not English, by holding on to their Celtic roots. The Kingdom of Mercia bordered the entirety of Wales, and very frequently, the Welsh kingdoms had border disputes with Mercia, or were cross-border raiding in the kingdom. So, in response, a dike was constructed along the supposed border between Mercia and Wales. Powys, the largest Welsh kingdom to border Mercia, and the other Welsh kingdoms, had to have been an intense threat to have warranted such an immense project of earthworks. Griffith ap Llywelyn rose to power in Powys, and saw that the kingdom of Gwynedd was struggling with a succession crisis, as their king passed away. So, in this confusion, Llywelyn took control of the state, and became the ruler of Gwynedd and Powys. But Llywelyn's expansionist goals did not stop there, as he attacked the kingdom of Dyfed, and added their lands to his rapidly growing kingdom. And as a justification for his conquest in Wales, he is quoted in saying, "Speak not of killing. I but blunt the horns of the offspring of Wales, lest they should injure their dam." Generally what this means is that Llywelyn believed not that he was conquering the Welsh people for the sake of killing them, but to prevent their self-destruction, especially as the threat of England to the east became increasingly prominent. After several more years of conquest, Llywelyn was able to unite all of Wales, making him the first individual in history to do so, and the first ever king of Wales. Llywelyn was able to secure the safety of his kingdom, as he allied to the Earl of Mercia, whose land bordered Wales. And at the time, Mercia was part of England, which meant that this ally in Mercia protected Wales from the English, who wanted to conquer Wales. This relationship devolved, though, as the Earl of Mercia passed away, and no new alliance was formed with the new Earl. And almost immediately, Wales was under a surprise attack by the English. At one point, Llywelyn fled, and was seeking refuge from the English deep in Wales, and it is said that a Welsh noble killed him and sent Llywelyn's head to the English as proof of the murder. And now, after Llywelyn's death, the English left, and the Welsh lands were once again divided. This greatly weakened the Welsh kingdoms. But the English still feared them. So, along the Welsh border, a few lordships were established, who were given near-kingly powers, called the Marcher Lords. This power was given so that the Marcher Lords would be able to accrue wealth, to be able to make any gains against the Welsh that they could. And although these lords made some progress in their conquest, it was extremely difficult to do, as every time lands were conquered in Wales, the people were intensely unruly and resisted the occupation as much as possible. Not to mention, the mountains and the military might of Wales made even the conquest arduous and extremely costly. So what the English decided to do as they conquered lands was to build castles everywhere and send as many English settlers as they could into the region, in attempts to pacify the people. There was a near constant back and forth, as Welsh lands were conquered, then freed, with only small gains being made at a time by the English, as Welsh kingdoms were small, but numerous. Llywelyn Fawr, king of Gwynedd, went on a campaign in conquering much of Wales, and expelling the English from much of their newly conquered land in Welsh territory. And Llywelyn Fawr, after consolidating these lands, was focused on maintaining a united Gwynedd after his death, in hopes to keep the English at bay. However, after Llywelyn's death, the English told his son, Dafydd, who succeeded him, that he could not keep the land beyond the traditional Gwynedd border. Obviously, this new king rejected these demands, and an all-out war was declared by the English, who through great trouble, defeated the Welsh army and pushed their borders back. But Dafydd wasn't willing to give up that easy, and after a while, he allied with many princes of Wales, who revolted against the English, and he succeeded in regaining much of his former territory. But in the midst of this fighting, Dafydd passed away, and his heirs, Owain and Llywelyn, were forced into a peace treaty, which shrunk the range of the Welsh to the smallest extent it had ever been. The English were unsurprisingly cruel to the Welsh, as they resisted their occupation. Around the time that princes of Wales started to appeal to the kingdom of Gwynedd for respite from the English, Llywelyn, the heir of Dafydd, was the sole ruler of the kingdom, and with the aid from these conquered Welsh, Llywelyn was able to reconquer much of Wales. Through a lot of diplomacy, Llywelyn was able to secure the independence of Wales as a vassal of England for a time. But after a new king came to the English throne, Llywelyn refused to pay homage. This began another series of wars, which resulted in the total annexation of Wales by England. And in the Statute of Rhuddlan, English common law was established in Wales, and a majority of Welsh nobles were replaced by English nobles. At the same time, Welshmen were not afforded the same rights as an Englishman, and the Welsh language and culture was attempted to be suppressed. These factors led to a long period of rebellion, where princes of Wales would revolt, many of the Welsh rebel leaders using the 100 Years' War as a reason to rebel, as they saw that the English were stretched thin from the war. But these rebels could not gain enough support, or simply did not have the resources to defeat England, in spite of their best efforts. Under the British, the lands of Wales were generally divided into two amorphous regions, called the Englishry and the Welshry. The Englishry was the more arable land, where the English had more control and would put more effort into converting the local people, while the Welshry was the less tamed uplands of Wales, where the English had less control and the people remained generally undisturbed by the change in ruler. Wales would soon be hit by the Black Plague, but as the British didn't really care about the Welsh, the impact that the disease had on the local people is largely left undocumented. Afterwards, there would be one final major independence movement, under the leadership of Owain Glyndŵr, after he suffered several injustices by the English. His army was initially a small force, but as this army saw successes, many other parts of Wales began to revolt, and Owain's army grew. There were even reports of Welshmen throughout England leaving their homes to join this rebellion. Owain was even able to gain the assistance of the French, who, several times, landed in England. But once Welsh armies began to taste a few defeats against the English, the French backed off. And now, the English regained control over the territory, and even more strict penalties for the Welsh were put in place to keep this from ever happening again. Despite this, Owain was never captured, leaving his later life a mystery and an often romanticized tale. The Welsh were very famous for their longbow archers, and so, the subjugation of this land added an important base of highly skilled bowmen who played vital roles in many major wars and battles. The War of the Roses would soon break out in England, and many key figures held Welsh blood. So, on both sides of the Civil War, many Welsh fought. The victor of this war, Henry VII, was himself in fact Welsh, and his son Henry VIII repealed many laws that restricted the Welsh, making them full citizens. And he made great efforts to integrate Wales into England. And in the many English civil wars to come, the Welsh generally allied with the Royalists, and at one point, Wales was the last holdout for the British Royalists. And now we hit a period where Wales generally hits the back seat, as England is more focused on annexing the Scottish, subjugating the Irish, and colonizing the world. There was a fairly significant Welsh migration into the Americas, with several attempts to form Welsh colonies, but these never really came to be. As the British Isles began to industrialize, Wales was found to be rich in minerals, especially coal, which brought many new jobs to the region. However, this work was difficult, and because of it, the Welsh gained stereotypes from the English as being subhuman and dirty. All of this culminated in several uprisings of Welsh workers against the British, one of the most prominent being the Murtha Rising, where several thousand workers were in open protest. After being fired upon by the British military, the Welsh workers took over the town of Mercia and demanded raised wages and improved conditions. But the protesters would be dispersed at gunpoint, destroying the movement. Because of the First World War, the coal industry boomed, as did the Welsh economy, and although many Welshmen fought on the front lines, many were contributing to the war from back at home, in the mines. But once the war was over, coal demand tanked, as well as oil being more commonly used as a fuel source, and the Welsh suffered for it dearly. Not to mention, the Great Depression hit Wales hard, with unemployment hitting nearly 45%. During the Second World War, the ports in Wales were a constant target during German air raids. But after the war, Welsh nationalism surged, and amazingly, the Celtic culture and language of Wales has remained one of the most robust in Great Britain, despite their years of subjugation under the British. The Welsh even gained their own assembly under the English, only gaining so by a slim majority in the vote. And although Wales is part of Great Britain, it gained the recognition that defined it as its own country in its own right, and that's Wales highlighted. Please like and subscribe if you liked the video, And if you have any suggestions or comments, leave them in the comment section below, or email me, with my email in the description. I also started a Patreon, if anyone is interested in supporting a small creator like myself.